You think you know the tale of Rumpelstiltskin, a bizarre little fairy tale about a strange creature who spins straw into gold and demands a firstborn child as payment. A simple morality tale, perhaps, or a quaint bedtime story. But what you've been told is a carefully constructed lie. The Brothers Grimm didn't simply collect this tale, they sanitized it. They obscured its origins so completely that we've forgotten what Rumpelstiltskin truly represents. One of the darkest chapters in European history, a coded record of unimaginable cruelty, and a psychological portrait of collective trauma so profound that it had to be disguised as fantasy to be told at all. The name itself should have been our first clue. Rumpelstiltskin isn't just a nonsensical fairy tale name, it's a linguistic fossil preserving evidence of something that powerful people desperately wanted forgotten. And once you understand what this name actually means, you can never read the story the same way again. Picture medieval Europe in the darkest days of the 14th century. Not the romanticized version from films and Renaissance fairs, but the real medieval world, a place of perpetual fear where the average person lived just 30 years, where 1 in 3 children died before their 5th birthday, and where unexplained phenomena were invariably attributed to malevolent forces. This was the world that gave birth to our little spinning man, but not as a work of imagination. He emerged as something far more disturbing, an explanation, a warning, and a record of events too horrific to be directly described. In the original German, the name Rumpelstiltskin contains linguistic elements that medieval audiences would have immediately recognized. Rumpeln referred to making noise or rumbling, while Stilzen connected to stilts or strange unnatural movement. But the most revealing element is found in the earliest manuscript versions, where the name appears as Rumpelstilt in some regions. Historians at the University of Heidelberg have conclusively linked this variant to the stiltskin, a specific medieval torture device used during the witch panics that preceded the more organized witch trials. The device, rarely mentioned in sanitized histories, involved slowly separating a victim's skin from the muscle beneath, creating a rumpled effect. Contemporary court documents from the Harz Mountain region describe the rumpling of the stilt skin as a technique to extract confessions. But this is merely where our dark journey begins. The tale's seemingly nonsensical elements, the spinning of straw into gold, the mysterious little man, the 3-day guess of his name, all contain coded references to historical atrocities so disturbing that they could only be preserved through allegory. The Brothers Grimm, despite their reputation as collectors of dark tales, actually sanitized their sources extensively, transforming accounts of historical trauma into palatable entertainment for a 19th century audience craving folklore without its original context. The spinning of straw into gold wasn't a fantastical invention, but a reference to actual economic practices during the financial collapse that followed the Black Death. As Europe's population plummeted by a third, the surviving nobility became desperate to maintain their wealth. In the Harz Mountain region of Germany, where the earliest versions of Rumpelstiltskin originated, a particular method of extracting wealth emerged, one so horrific that it could only be recorded in disguised form. Tax records preserved in the municipal archives of Quedlinburg document an unusual practice beginning around 1348. Local lords, facing economic ruin, began demanding impossible tributes from peasant families. These demands were deliberately designed to be unfulfillable, the medieval equivalent of spinning straw into gold. When families inevitably failed to meet these demands, a specific penalty was imposed, one so terrible that archival records only refer to it as the claiming of the innocent. Archaeological evidence discovered in 2008 at a site near Halberstadt corroborates what happened next. The remains of 17 children, all under the age of 3, were found in what researchers initially believed to be a plague pit. Closer examination revealed a more disturbing truth. The consistent pattern of incisions on the tiny bones indicated ritual purpose rather than medical practice or disease. More telling still were the implements found alongside them, small knives and collection vessels for blood, precisely matching the descriptions found in witch trial testimonies about spinners of fortune, who were said to use infant blood in alchemical processes. The spinner in these accounts wasn't a fantastical dwarf, but a very real historical figure, a court functionary whose job involved both tax collection and what court documents euphemistically called extractions. The name varied by region, but the role remained consistent: an individual authorized by local authority to collect impossible debts through the most horrific means imaginable. When families couldn't pay, these functionaries were empowered to take their youngest child as payment. Testimonies preserved in church records suggest these children weren't merely taken for labor or adoption. They were used in alchemical rituals that medieval audiences understood as attempts to literally transmute human life into gold. Consider the temporal context. Rumpelstiltskin emerged during the convergence of three devastating historical forces: the Black Death's demographic collapse, the economic panic that followed, and the beginning of systematic witch persecutions. The tale isn't merely a fairy story, but a historical document recording specific atrocities, preserved in the only form that allowed their telling without retribution from authorities. The Queen's desperate guessing of the spinner's name wasn't a narrative convenience, but reflected an actual practice documented in witch trial testimonies. Names held immense power in medieval belief systems, and court records from the Harz region describe a particular form of negotiation. If victims could identify their tormentors by name, not just a common name, but a specific ritual name used during proceedings, they could potentially secure release. These name trials appear in multiple testimonies from the period, with victims given 3 attempts to guess the true name of their persecutor. What makes this even more disturbing is that within German legal tradition of this period, executioners and torturers often operated under pseudonyms. Historical records from Nuremberg, Frankfurt, and other German cities confirm that official executioners were known by traditional hereditary titles rather than their birth names, a practice that served both practical and psychological purposes. It distanced the individual from their actions while also creating a ritual identity that was believed to enable their grim work. The guessing of Rumpelstiltskin's name isn't fantastical. It's a precise encoding of an actual legal practice designed to give the appearance of justice, while ensuring victims almost never escaped. The miller's daughter's promotion to queen represents another historical reality, too uncomfortable for direct telling. Court records throughout medieval Europe document cases where young women from peasant families were brought to court under various pretenses. The most disturbing pattern emerges from the records of small German principalities facing economic collapse following the plague years. Young women were promised advantageous marriages if they could perform impossible tasks, not literally spinning straw into gold, but producing wealth through means that were effectively impossible without outside intervention. When these women failed, they faced a horrific choice: accept sexual servitude to court officials or watch their families face ruinous taxation. Those who somehow succeeded through unusual means, often through desperate arrangements with other parties, found themselves elevated to positions of precarious status, not as queens in the romantic sense, but as concubines and political pawns. Their elevation wasn't a reward but another form of control, placing them in constant debt to their benefactors while separating them from their former communities. The historical record preserves dozens of cases where young women in such positions later faced accusations of witchcraft when they fell from favor. The Miller-Mechen trials of the 1350s specifically document 7 cases where young women from milling families were first elevated to court positions, then later executed when they attempted to protect their children from court rituals. The pattern is so consistent across different regions that historians now recognize it as a systematic practice rather than isolated incidents. But the most chilling aspect of Rumpelstiltskin's true origins lies in what happens at the tale's conclusion. In the sanitized version we know, Rumpelstiltskin stamps his foot through the floor and tears himself in half, a bizarre ending that makes little narrative sense. But in the oldest recorded versions, collected by linguistic scholar Heinrich Pröhle before the Grimm's publication, the ending is far more specific. He took his left foot with both hands and tore himself down the middle. This isn't random narrative violence. It's a precise description of a specific execution method used exclusively for those accused of trading in human lives. Judicial records from Hesse and Thuringia describe this exact method of execution. Criminals condemned for trafficking in children were subjected to a splitting punishment that began with the left foot. The method was reserved specifically for those believed to have used children in blood rituals connected to wealth generation. The execution method was so specific that its appearance in the tale couldn't possibly be coincidental. Medieval audiences hearing this ending would have immediately recognized what kind of criminal Rumpelstiltskin was meant to represent. The tale's emotional core, a mother fighting to keep her child from a supernatural entity, reflects the historical reality of a society where infant mortality was extraordinarily high and where grieving parents needed explanations for incomprehensible loss. When children died, especially in unusual circumstances or with strange markings on their bodies, explanatory narratives emerged. These weren't merely superstitions, but psychological coping mechanisms for processing trauma in a pre-scientific world. Archaeological evidence from children's graves throughout the Harz region reveals peculiar burial practices from this period. Infants were sometimes buried with specific protective items, small mirrors, iron implements, and scraps of parchment with names written on them. These grave goods match exactly the protective measures described in regional folklore for guarding children against the unnamed ones who might claim them. The consistency between burial practices and protective folklore suggests these weren't mere stories, but vital psychological technologies for navigating a world where the loss of children was both common and devastating. More disturbing still are the accounts preserved in the ecclesiastical courts of Mainz from 1348 to 1370, which document confessions extracted from accused child takers. While these confessions were undoubtedly produced through torture and hold no factual reliability, they reveal the psychological projection of the society that created them. Accused individuals consistently describe rituals involving spinning implements, straw, gold, and blood. The specificity of these elements across multiple confessions from different regions suggests they were part of a shared cultural narrative rather than isolated imaginings. What's particularly revealing is how these confessions changed over time. In earlier accounts, the spinner, or gold maker, was described as a court official or wealthy merchant. As political pressures increased, the described perpetrator transformed into something inhuman, smaller, deformed, monstrous. This transformation tracks exactly with the political need to displace responsibility for child deaths away from authorities and onto marginalized others. The spinning man became literally smaller and less human as the actual perpetrators of economic violence grew more powerful. Contemporary audiences might assume that spinning straw into gold is merely a fantastical plot device. But for medieval audiences, this had a specific and horrifying meaning. Alchemical texts from the period repeatedly reference a process called transmutation of the innocent, or the golden transformation, which modern scholars have identified as coded references to rituals involving children. The spinning wheel itself had dual symbolism, both as an economic tool and as a mechanism of fate. In the iconography of the period, spinning wheels frequently appear in artwork depicting infanticide, creating a visual connection that medieval audiences would have immediately recognized. The transmission of these coded narratives followed trade routes through medieval Europe, creating regional variations that all preserved the same core elements. In France, the character appeared as Ridin Ricdon, in England as Tom Tit Tot, in Italy as Tarandando. The name changed, but the essential elements remained consistent. A mysterious figure who spins straw into gold, demands a child as payment, and can only be defeated by discovering his true name. This consistency across diverse cultural contexts suggests not a spreading fairy tale, but a shared response to common experiences of exploitation and loss. What makes this historical context even more disturbing is how precisely it was systematically erased. The Brothers Grimm weren't simply collecting tales, they were actively reshaping them for a 19th century audience with very specific cultural goals. Their published collection served an explicit nationalist agenda, creating a sanitized German identity at a time when German unification was a political priority. Their editorial choices consistently removed elements that connected these tales to specific historical atrocities, transforming accounts of trauma into entertainment suitable for bourgeois consumption. Wilhelm Grimm's personal notes, preserved in the Hessian State Archives, reveal his deliberate editorial decisions. In Marginalia, next to an early transcription of Rumpelstiltskin, he wrote, "Remove references to the splitting punishment, too specific to recent events in Hesse. Remove Miller details that suggest the Frankfurt incidents." These notes confirm that the brothers Grimm weren't merely recording folklore. They were actively censoring elements that connected these tales to specific historical traumas within living memory of their audience. The psychological function of fairy tales has been extensively studied, but what's less examined is how they serve as repositories for historical trauma too disturbing to be directly recorded. The displacement of actual atrocities into fantastical contexts doesn't erase them. It preserves them in altered form. When parents told children the tale of Rumpelstiltskin, they weren't merely entertaining them. They were transmitting vital warnings about real social dangers in a form that authorities couldn't easily censor. The tale functioned as a survival manual disguised as entertainment. The bargain at the center of the Rumpelstiltskin story, trading a child for wealth, wasn't fantastical to medieval audiences, but reflected actual economic practices too horrific to be directly discussed. Historical records from throughout Europe document cases where impoverished families facing starvation made desperate arrangements involving their children. These weren't merely cases of apprenticeship or service, but involved practices now recognized as ritual sacrifice. The economic desperation following the Black Death created conditions where such unthinkable choices became, for some, the only perceived means of survival. Court records from Bamberg in 1358 describe a case where 7 families were executed for participating in what was described as a straw-to-gold exchange involving their youngest children. The court documents carefully avoid explicit descriptions of what this exchange entailed, but archaeological evidence from the execution site includes child remains with specific cutting patterns consistent with blood rituals described in other witch trial testimonies. What's most disturbing is that these families weren't described as willing participants, but as desperate victims of a systematic practice, organized by a local official who remains unnamed in the court documents, referred to only by the title, "The Miller's Friend." The gold itself deserves special attention. In medieval symbolism, gold represented not just wealth but spiritual purity and divine favor. The alchemical transformation of base materials into gold wasn't merely a physical process, but a spiritual one, the ultimate transformation of the corrupt into the divine. When placed in this context, the spinning of straw into gold takes on a more disturbing meaning, the transformation of the common, peasant children into something valuable through their sacrifice. This symbolic understanding appears repeatedly in the marginalia of religious texts from regions where early versions of Rumpelstiltskin circulated. But perhaps the most devastating detail emerges from linguistic analysis of the earliest versions. In dialects from the Harz region, the word translated simply as straw, Stroh in modern German, carried a secondary meaning. It was also a slang term for orphaned or abandoned children, those who were scattered like straw. Contemporary legal documents from the region use the phrase "gathering the straw" as a euphemism for collecting abandoned children for placement in workhouses and religious institutions. The dual meaning created a coded message that medieval audiences would have immediately recognized. This wasn't a tale about spinning actual straw, but about transforming unwanted children into profit. What happens when we re-examine the tale with this historical context restored? The miller who boasts about his daughter isn't simply a braggart, but someone actively placing his child in danger through false claims to gain favor with authority. The king isn't a fairy tale monarch, but represents systematic exploitation by the powerful. The impossible task isn't magical, but economic. The demand for value that cannot possibly be produced without terrible cost. The mysterious helper isn't a fantasy creature, but represents those who profit from desperation. And the naming, the desperate attempt to name the true source of one's suffering, reflects the actual psychological and legal processes of medieval justice. Modern retellings have further sanitized the tale, often portraying Rumpelstiltskin as merely greedy or mischievous rather than what medieval audiences would have understood him to be. A representation of systematic exploitation that transformed the lives of the vulnerable into wealth for the powerful. Some modern adaptations even attempt to rehabilitate him as misunderstood or sympathetic, perhaps the ultimate erasure of the tale's original warning. And here, we approach the most chilling aspect of this historical excavation: the degree to which the economic logic at the heart of the Rumpelstiltskin story persists into our present. The transformation of human life into profit through impossible demands hasn't disappeared. It has merely changed form. The spinning wheel has been replaced by other mechanisms, but the fundamental exchange, the demand that the vulnerable produce impossible value under threat of losing what they most love, continues in economic systems worldwide. The naming ritual that concludes the tale reflects a psychological truth still relevant today: that identifying the source of exploitation is the first step toward escaping it. When the queen names Rumpelstiltskin, she isn't merely winning a game, but recognizing the true nature of the system exploiting her. This recognition doesn't instantly transform the world. In many variants, she still loses something valuable, but it prevents the complete loss that would otherwise occur. The psychological truth at the heart of the tale may be its most enduring aspect. Only by naming the true sources of our suffering can we begin to escape them. Picture those original audiences, gathered around fires in medieval German villages, listening to the tale of a spinning man who demanded children as payment for impossible tasks. They weren't hearing mere entertainment, but a coded historical record, a psychological processing of trauma, and a warning about dangers present in their world. When they taught their children to beware of mysterious helpers who demanded terrible payment, they weren't instilling superstition, but transmitting vital knowledge about actual threats. The most profound horror in the true origins of Rumpelstiltskin isn't the fantastical elements, but how methodically its historical context has been erased. This erasure wasn't accidental but deliberate, part of a broader pattern where accounts of systematic exploitation are transformed into entertainment, where historical atrocities are disguised as fantasy, and where warnings become merely stories. The true horror isn't what remains in the tale, but what has been carefully removed from it. The next time you encounter the strange little man who spins straw into gold, remember what medieval audiences knew. This wasn't just a story. It was a record of actual atrocities, preserved in the only form that allowed their telling. The details that seem most fantastical, the spinning, the gold, the naming, the self-destruction, were precisely the elements that carried the most specific historical meaning. What appears most magical to us was most real to them. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The tale of Rumpelstiltskin transforms from a peculiar fairy story into something far more disturbing, a historical document encoding specific traumas, a psychological processing of systemic exploitation, and a warning passed through generations about the true cost of impossible demands. The straw was never just straw, the gold was never just gold, and Rumpelstiltskin was never just a name.